You're listening to the I Love You Keep Going podcast with George Haas. For more information, please visit our website at www.mettagroup.org. That's www.mettagroup.org.
We're going to talk about secure attachment systems and relational systems this morning. And then later I'll talk about how to begin the repair process of attachment if you have insecure, disorganized attachment. And then we'll do some ideal parent figure toward the end. Stas is going to carry us through the first part. But if I wanted to just ask if there were any questions about material that's already been presented. So in disorganized attachment, the attachment system goes off and the fight or flight system goes off and cancels out the drive for closeness. And so you have that sense of not wanting to be close. Disorganized attachment is complex. So you have fearfully preoccupied, fearfully avoidant, and then complexly disorganized. So if your disorganization, and what that really means is that you have the capacity to dissociate as a way of regulating your experience. If you're dissociative, then there's always going to be a next in the succession of attachment identifiers, and that could be a preoccupied, a dismissing or an avoidance strategy. And then some people are complexly disorganized, which means they use 2 or 3 of the strategies. So dismissing and preoccupied, and sometimes secure strategies. One of the things about complexly disorganized people is that they're really hard to predict how they're going to react, because they could come at you from 3 different distinct attachment responses. And so one of the things that create reliability in relationships is your ability to predict how somebody is going to respond to a communication that you make to them. This is important to understand because you can then learn how to communicate to somebody and learn how to say something to them so that they can receive it and respond to it in a meaningful way. And if somebody is just completely all over the place, and you'd have to formulate it 3 ways in order to cover all the bases, you become very tentative and very careful in your conversation. From a mentalizing perspective, you become over monitoring and shut down the spontaneity in the relationship. So it becomes laborious, difficult. We develop these working models of ourselves and these working models of other people. And in disorganized people, the working model of self tends to be the one that says, I'm incapable, I'm not worthy, I'm not good enough. And then the perception of the world is that the world is a dangerous place and people are actively out to get me. So I have to be super careful in the way that I interact with people. If you contrast that to securely attached people, secure people think that they're capable and desirable and that the world is happy to meet their needs. And so they go about the world as if that's how the world is. Can you imagine the difference between thinking that you're capable and people are interested in you, and that the world is your oyster waiting for you to go out, and somebody who thinks that the world is out to get them, that they have to be constantly vigilant or that they'll be physically harmed? You're following me on this one. So secure people are free to be spontaneous, that they're authentic, so that they're able to be spontaneous and authentic. They don't have to preview everything like dismissing people do. So you'll notice in dismissing people that they think that they're the greatest thing since sliced bread, but that is actually masking a deep core belief that they're incapable of getting their needs met. And they think that the world is filled with people who have things that they want, that they have the privilege to take because they're the next best thing since sliced bread. But they're also very calculating. So they over monitor and they don't feel. And so they tend to rehearse everything through the self-experience before they present it to the world. So they're not spontaneous, and it can be quite apparent in the way that they operate that they're not spontaneous. Preoccupied people, of course, don't monitor. So they're just chaotic and reactive in their expression. So that's also something that you have a sense that you need to manage. But fearful avoidant people tend to be hidden, invisible, and fearfully preoccupied people tend to be chaotic and demanding. That's one of the ways that you tell them apart. But disorganized people are really not able to form stable, lasting relationships. And so they come and go from relationships pretty quickly most of the time, or the relationships are in fits and starts. So they have an intense experience of somebody for a few weeks, and then there's a lot of space. And the key of the underlying cause of that is the lack of reliability. But that lack of reliability translates into a lot of relationship failures in disorganized people. And so by the time disorganized people get into their mid-30s, they get to a place where they become more and more reluctant to risk not the relationship so much, but the disappointment of another failed relationship. And so they begin to withdraw from actively pursuing relationships to the point that they can get quite isolated. The problem with being quite isolated is that it's not the way that the human body is designed. The human body is designed to operate in complex social groups. And so if you withdraw yourself from social groups because you're avoiding the disappointment of another failed relationship and the discomfort of not really being able to understand why you can't do it, but other people seem to be able to do it, is that you live a very painful, emotionally dysregulated life on your own because you've withdrawn yourself. You've withdrawn yourself to avoid difficult emotional experiences, but there isn't a withdrawing from social life that isn't painful. And so you have a level of pain that actually is quite high in comparison to people that are not isolated. Is that making sense? The reason that disorganized people have a 70% rate of addiction is because that level of painfulness has to be managed in some way. And if you can't manage it with other people, then you manage it with substances or processes. The problem with substances or processes is that there's a built-in tolerance feature to them. You start out 2 sips of wine or a toke on a joint, and then it's a glass of wine, then it's 2 glasses of wine, then it's the bottle, then it's more than 1 bottle. And when the doses to regulate the distressing emotion have to get high enough to be regulating, they can begin to interfere in your ability to basically function. And it's usually at the point that your capacity to function in general society is compromised by the level of the doses that you have to take, that you get outside interference in what's happening. Sometimes that can be helpful, sometimes not. The higher the dose, of course, the lower your ability to function, the less likely you are to be able to get into sustained relationships. So it's a vicious cycle that pulls you down pretty hard. So we tend to look at these as skill sets. I like to look at them as skill sets because I like to have lists of things that I can do so that I don't feel powerless. And so you can evaluate your skill set, what you have, what you don't have, and then you can begin to develop the skill sets that you don't have, reinforce the ones that you do. It's usually a mixed bag, and begin to overcome the obstacles that have been set in place by the conditioning that you received. We tend to talk about this in three ways. One is the reparenting or the remapping of the conditioning so that when you're in a situation in the present moment, you can spontaneously create a different reality than the conditioning would have habitually caused you to create. The second is that you develop your capacity to mentalize. Insecure and disorganized people tend to mentalize less well than secure people. And disorganized people really have a deficit in their ability to mentalize. That was an important defense in childhood. You didn't want to really put together the picture of what was happening in your household because it was bad. And so if you can't think through, you can't make sense out of things, you're actually relieved from the impact of what is actually happening. But you can't function well enough in secure relationships because you can't keep up with the mental activity of the people that you're trying to be in relationship to. So you need to begin to develop your mentalizing capacity. We use a meditation basis for that. We call that the 84 meditations, which are meant to develop your mentalizing capacity. And then you need to develop the positive side of experience. Most people who have addiction have grown up in environments that are decidedly lopsided on negative experience and not so much development. On the positive side, these are two separate systems. So you have a well-developed capacity for negative experience, but not a good capacity for positive experience. It doesn't matter whether it's a negative experience or a positive experience. If it exceeds the window of tolerance, you need a regulating strategy for that. And if you've used addiction for a long time, what you'll find is that most of the ways that you regulate emotional events that exceed the window of tolerance involve substances or processes. That's the setup for addiction. We talked about that in the first module of craving and urging. You need to recognize when the mind is thinking about using it and direct it to think about other things that are emotionally regulating. So this next part of the mentalizing piece is the emotional regulation piece. And you need to develop the capacity to tolerate very intense positive experiences so that you can begin to weight the conditioning on the positive side of things. You want to overbalance the working model of yourself and the working model of other people on the positive side so that you have this sense of positivity when you think about engaging in relationships. Because if you've got it set up so that you have a negative experience each time the sense of self arises, and you have a negative experience each time the sense of other people arises, you're going to have to push through that resistance even to begin to try again. The core of self-hatred is a working model of self that is loaded down with negative experiences. So you need to intentionally develop positive experience. We can do this through both the mentalizing emotional regulation piece and also through the remapping piece with the use of ideal parent figure protocol. Is that making sense? The core of self-hatred is this working model of self that arises that's loaded down with negative experiences, and we begin to have an aversive response to so much negativity arising every time the sense of self arises that we become aversive to it, and that aversion leads into a place of self-hatred. I just can't bear this intense negative experience arising every time my sense of self arises. And there can also be a sense of helplessness in what to do about that. And the way out of that is to do a ton of the hard practices for the sense of self, so that when the sense of self arises, it's largely a positive experience which you enjoy having, which is actually the root of self-love. You're delighted by your own experience of self as it arises, rather than aversive to it. Makes sense? I am describing these things in practices that anybody can do. So you can actually do this if you can get yourself to do it. So maybe there is also the decision to be made that you are worth it and your life is worth it to do these practices, to shift this. When we grow up in the way that the human body grows up, we are unconscious for the first 3 or 4 years of our lives. That is to say, there's no self-reflective experience. And so we come into existence with these working models of self that are weighted down by negativity, and there is no alternative. We've never known an alternative to that negative self experience. And so this is again one of those things where the no-brainer once you get to the other side. I'm reminded of the monk that calls across the river to the meditation master. How do I get to the other side of the river? And the meditation master yells back, you're already on the other side of the river. Stephen?
Yeah. So you've had like many years, if not decades, of this of these heart practices.
Yes.
Where you sort of really, yeah, and yet, and a lot of and the mentalizing, and yet you say you only earned your security what 5 years ago or something.
Yes.
So how does that work? Like, I mean, it doesn't give me much faith that it's going to work. For me, if you've had decades of it, I mean, I guess you're going to say ideal parent figure now. I don't know. That was maybe the missing part or something, but
you have to
you know
do all
the
parts or it doesn't work. Archimedes said, give me a place to place my fulcrum and I can move the earth. You remember the old Greek guys? Anyway, attachment conditioning is extremely durable. It's extremely resilient. And if you don't push at it in the right way, nothing happens to it. It just stays the way that it is and it functions the way that it's meant to function. This has good advantages because they have good attachment. Then it weathers difficult times. And if you have poor attachment, it's still durable. So you have to push it in the right way to get it to shift.
But did it work for you though? I mean, if it...
Well, you know, with Mettagroup, when I started to explore using meditation for attachment, we did the mentalizing emotional regulation strategy, and we did the psychoeducation around collaborative relationship systems and attachment functioning, and it did not work.
Mm-hmm.
When we added the ideal parent figure to that mix, it worked pretty consistently with everybody who does the program. So it was. I mean, I was doing AAIs before and after from the beginning of trying this project so that we could see whether the project was working or not, and it didn't work, and it was clear that it didn't work. And then when we met Dan, when I met Dan Brown and we brought in the ideal parent figures, he was doing a 3-pillar model that was therapeutically, you know, psychotherapy based. So ideal parent figure, mentalization training, but in the context of the therapeutic relationship, and then psychoeducation around collaborative relationship systems. And in the therapy model, the third pillar of collaborative relationship systems is really they think of it as the transference relationship in therapy, which is going to teach that. Now, I am actually not confident on that because I had 28 years of really good therapy, and my attachment strategy is unfazed by that.
Yeah, sounds familiar.
But so in the meditation approach, where you're doing the meditations and around mentalizing and emotional regulation, what we noticed in the study that we did was that the mentalization of the meditators was a point or a point and a half higher on the 1 to 9 scale than non-meditators, but that didn't have a direct effect on the attachment outcome. Once we added the ideal parent figure into it, the system worked in the time frame that the therapeutic model worked. So we are comfortable with that claim that you can use a meditation approach rather than a psychotherapeutic approach if you want. But you have to do all 3 pillars.
Is the heart practice in the? It's not really one of the pillars, is it?
It's in the second pillar in our model, which is the mentalizing and the heart practices. So the mentalizing and emotional regulation. In order to replace an afflictive emotional regulation strategy that you have, you need to replace it with something that works as well or better. The mind won't accept it. So you can't just stop afflictive strategies. You have to stop and replace them with something that works to emotionally regulate you, which can't be dysregulated. So you're going to have to develop the capacity to do this. So we like the noting feeling states technique and any of the heart practices as a substitute for the afflictive self-generated emotion strategy that you're using, but you have to be disciplined in stopping the afflictive strategies. Now, mostly the reason that you stop the afflictive strategies is that some part of using the afflictive strategy feels good, right? So you imagine annihilating, as I said to Shinzen, how many times do you think in your imagination you could annihilate everyone on Earth? And he said, I don't think there's a limit. You know, look at our culture. We use extreme violent fantasy as a divertimento, you know, you look at action movies or all the rest of it. How many movies have you watched where the first thing that happens in the movie is a woman is brutally murdered? I mean, it is a terrible acclimatization that we have to this stuff. If you go and, you watch Game of Thrones, 10,000 people are murdered on the screen in an hour and a half. We have this built in, these kinds of strategies from the very beginning, so we need to really begin to uproot these. And one of the things about using violent fantasy, for instance, is that it creates fear of revenge. And so it actually, while it's soothing, while it's going on, later you're more fearful than you were before because you're anticipating a response. With the part of the mind that engages in this doesn't differentiate between what happens and what's imagined. And so as the Buddha said, you need to be the guardian of your sense gates so that you have perspective of the world that actually is in line with them. Is that making sense?
Yeah. Sometimes I feel like the heart practices, it sounds like a weird comparison, but like hibiscus tea, when they first tested it out, they thought the oxidation levels were incredibly high compared to green tea or anything. And then they did another test, and then they found out it just sort of peaks and then it comes down, and it comes down to basically the level it was before.
Right.
And then sometimes I feel like that's what heart practice does for me. It ramps up my capacity to be loving and kind, but it comes down. I forget about it really quickly, and then I do it again, and it just peaks and comes down. That's sometimes what my experience feels like.
So then the idea is, the way that we teach it is as a view or as a mind state, rather than as an emotional feeling. And then what we want you to begin to do is track mind state so that you can begin to understand how you're making the experience of the reality that you're making. This basic Buddhist concept is that, and this is quite different than a Western concept. You take in the data around you, but you don't take in all of the data. You cherry pick the data which matches your preferences, your map, your conditioning. and you bring that inside, you assign meaning to it, you create a model of what's happening, and then you project that out. And you operate in the model of meaning that you have created based on what's happening in the world, not what's happening in the world, right? This is one of those fundamental shifts in consciousness. You are wandering around a world that you have created based on what it means to you, not based on what's there, right? Is that making sense? This is very different from Western conditioning because, going back to Aristotle and Epicurus, they said that we take in all of the data around us and we create an accurate working model inside of us as to what's going on. And we operate from that working model, and that we largely make an accurate representation of what's happening, which is completely different than the Eastern Buddhist view, which is we actually create a map of meaning, what it means to us, not a map of what's going on. I don't know about your experience, but my experience is I live in a world that means what I'm experiencing, and it can be quite different. Have you ever been looking for your car keys and found them in the same place you already looked 5 times? When you made the initial 4 visits to that spot, you didn't create the car keys in that spot. That's the level of appearance that it is. Everything is conceptual based on your interpretation of the data and what it means to you. So we really operate in these maps of meaning. So we need to get into the database and add entries. That's why the ideal parent figure works so well, because you get into the database and you layer in these visualizations of alternatives to what actually happened to you. The part of the mind that creates conceptual reality doesn't care whether it happened and it's in the database or it's something to be imagined, because when we're encountering a novel experience, we have to imagine it anyway. And so that process of creating conceptual reality is an intertwining of the database of what actually happened to you and what those outcomes were, and your imagination. Is that making sense? Now, you might say to me, I'm doing this ideal parent figure work, and it's these imaginations, and it's not real, but neither is conceptual reality. It's what you made it, right? So if you have in the database these entries that you can create a different version of conceptual reality that's beneficial to you as opposed to being afflictive to you, you can begin to operate in a world that's quite different. Then when you begin to formulate the world in a secure way and you interact with other people in a secure way, you have a memory of an actual experience of security, which is then added to the database so that you move beyond these imagined, clearly not real presentations of what security might be to actual experience of having that in the world. So it goes from this rickety structure of visualized experiences into a database of actual experiences. So it becomes more and more robust over time because it's not based on imagination anymore. It's based on things that have actually happened. Is that making sense?
Yeah. I think it's also, I just wanted to say that I think it's probably, I think it's dangerous to think that the way you interpret the world is the accurate way, you know?
Oh,
I know people that do that, and it's like, yeah, no, you want to always be open to being wrong, and the fact that it's subjective, of course, yeah.
We have a word for it, which is called psychic equivalence. That's what that is. What do you want to say, Stas?
Oh, Stephen, I was just going to say, I remember you were saying there's all these caring people around you that you might just not notice or take in the care. So I think that's part of what we're talking about. So I just want to say the whole field of positive priming, where, you say, may I be peaceful, you're inclining the minds toward positive states. and just automatically creating a positive sense of self and positive sense of world, those are separate. So you can't just, and that's what George was saying with the study is, just doing the meditation practice alone doesn't actually change the procedural memory. So you keep generating this alternative reality that now has the positive priming overlaid on it. So you have the positive states, but the ground is still the insecure map. So you have to do both of it. And then I would just say that the relational work is really significant, because imagine people saying, "Stephen, you're delightful. Your point of view really matters. You're so interesting. I can't wait to see you again." That keeps reinforcing it. So if you were in a secure household, you would just gotten that your whole life. So you would be telling us about how amazing what you're finding is now, and there would be no reason to isolate. It would just be obvious that you go out, find meaning, share it with people, and just keep doing that. So does that distinction between those two areas make sense?
Yeah, it does, and I get the like the sort of parallel with that you made about what I said about not recognizing people actually do care. Yeah, no, I do. I think I would be better at hard practices now, because I would probably imagine someone saying it to me like the same, because I've done a bit of IPF, and also when I meditate or mentalize, I imagine that my ideal parent, they feel what I feel and they describe it back to me, if you know what I mean.
That's attunement, exactly.
Yeah, it's like, since spending more time in IPF, I can do that. It seems to be very important that someone,
right,
that element, and I don't know, it's like when I say that to myself, it's like I don't believe it or something, like when I did it in the past. And that was the problem, and I was so small and insignificant. I need someone else to tell me somehow.
Yeah, so the other people will make it significant. So then your sense of self will change based on that. So, right, we're building it back up the way it's meant to happen in your early life, right? You come out with this negative sense of self, so then you have the ideal parents telling you, your needs matter. We can attune and pick up on that. And then eventually they start pushing you into exploration. And then because you're regulated, you feel safe, you have your secure base and secure haven you can come back to. You just explore, become dysregulated. We didn't really talk much about self-mastery, but that's one of the key things is if you just do the 3 pillars without the meditation, you may not pick up on self-mastery. So where you have this really clear sense of what you're about and the ways you can regulate. So let's say a situation comes up that's dysregulating, and you right away just say, I know just the right thing to regulate. So it's going to take the least amount of time and energy so it can get back to exploring. So that's self-mastery. So people where, people where they're just seemingly exploring all the time, they just go on these elaborate explorations and they don't really need to come back that much. That's self-mastery. So really just turbocharges your exploration so you can really go deep, keep going, and then you come back when you're ready to write your book or whatever it is you need to slow down for.
Thank you.
I think I'll just say one thing generally. It would be, have you guys seen the studies where they tell students, they're about to take a test and they tell the group of students that, this is a very difficult test and you're all very stupid. And then that group of students does much worse than the exact same test group when they just tell them, oh, this test is actually quite easy and you're all really good people and you're going to do really well. Just that switch in mind state can make a big difference. Secure people just carry it with them regardless of the situation. They tend to have that internalized. So I would, it all works together if you want to bring those strategies. They're portable. So then you're just positively priming yourself. You're pumping yourself up. So you can find those, opportunities to people out there.
Oh, this process that we're engaged in now is part of the third pillar, which is the psychoeducation around collaborative relationship systems. It is somewhat about the second pillar, although it's mainly an explanation of the second pillar, and you have to put your time in practice in order to get those things to happen. There should be in the Rizuku a series of meditations that you can do. We're just finishing recording them, so there'll be 140 guided meditations, which are meant to help improve the mentalizing and emotional regulation, and then also to generate positivity through the heart practices. Just go along and do them. Do one until you have a sense that you can do it, and then go on to the next one and do that. Just start at the beginning of the 84 meditations and go all the way through, and then start at the beginning of the divine abodes and go all the way through. That's what I would recommend. And then we have the ideal parent figure protocol. So ideal parent figure protocol is a remapping of the original conditioning, which is the re-entry into the databases of these different visualizations, which are meant to create I think that that James is asking how many do we do per hours a day. I think that if you do one of these a day, that would be 25 minutes, that would be enough to actually change this. So that would be your minimum, and then you can do as much as you want. No maximum, and the minimum is 25 minutes.
Is that plus the IPF on top of that, George, or
IPF is mainly what we do. Well, at least the way that we do it. We organize this in the next step from this class would be to take the level 2 class. And the level 2 class is going to provide you with a deeper dive into the mentalization, emotional regulation, and the collaborative relationship systems, and give you the introduction into ideal parent figure protocol. But ideal parent figure protocol is meant to be done as a one-on-one experience where the facilitator monitors you as you're practicing and then redirects you toward secure visualizations, because most of us who start from insecure or disorganized spaces don't recognize what secure functioning is, so we can't just spontaneously visualize it. So you need to have a facilitator help you direct the visualization toward a secure visualization, so that that's actually what you're planting in the database. Because if you don't have somebody monitoring you, you're just as likely to reinforce the insecure, disorganized attachment strategy that's currently operating. Not making sense?
so you're actually not doing? I mean, at the moment, I do IPF with the facilitator once a week, and I'm doing it on my own each day generally. But I haven't been doing any I haven't done any of the meditations because he said to come along to this workshop to learn about them. But what you're actually saying is maybe to replace the daily IPF with the meditations, and do the IPF with them once a week.
So the IPF, the only time that it would make sense in terms of a have to is if you find that the IPF session is dysregulating you and you're having a hard time coming back into balance. Then you might want to repeat the ideal parent figure session so that you can have the ideal parent figures help you emotionally regulate. But if that isn't the case, it's not necessary to do it in between.
Okay.
what's supposed to happen in childhood is that your caregivers are interested in you and interested in what you like and what you're good at, and then encourage you to develop those skills so that you develop a sense of agency and a sense of mastery and being able to pursue the things that have meaning. And in childhood, if that's what's happening, you go through dozens and dozens of things to see whether or not they're of interest to you. And in that process, you learn how to extract meaning from things so that you can orient yourself toward the things that have meaning, that have potential to provide meaning. And in family systems where that doesn't happen, this is, of course, neglect, what we're talking about now, where they are not attuned to you, they're not interested in your interests, they're not interested in creating an environment where you can explore your abilities and what has meaning for you, then you don't develop the skill of discerning what would be meaningful and what wouldn't be meaningful. And so rather than being actively engaged in that process, you need to start a little bit earlier and learn how to discern that. So I often share my apple story. Do you know my apple story?
Where you try a Granny Smith and you don't like it, but then you try a different apple instead, and you like it a bit better than the Granny Smith, and eventually you find an apple that you really like.
Right. So what you find though is that 25 of the apples that you try you don't like, but then you find the one that you do like. And actually, I bought some Gala apples, and they were not that good, and so I went online and I bought 6 different kinds of apples. And then I discovered that actually the problem was organic versus non-organic. The organic apples were flavorful and the non-organic apples weren't flavorful, and it didn't matter what variety they were. So I'm back to organic apples. But the mindset is, I'm looking for meaning in this, and I'm going to see whether there is any. And if there isn't, I'm going to see if there's any information in that discovery that would point me in the next direction of where I'm going to go look for meaning. And had you had an experience where you were encouraged and supported to do that, that's why we need that social network, so that you can weather the disappointment of not finding anything. And then they push you back out to go a little bit further. We have the other side of it where we know that there is meaning and that is vital. But until we have that understanding that there is meaning there and it is vital to the sense of fulfillment in our life, pushing up against all of that disappointment leaves us thinking, why would I do that? So that's what you need. So, when you say you're in a rock climbing group, that's a great place because everybody has a similar interest, and then you can exchange with interest and vitality the things that you're finding out. But then you can, I don't know, are you doing it in a gym? Then you can, what would immediately come to my mind was asking, where can we actually go out into the world and climb? Have you climbed anywhere? Do you know where that would be? And then you can have these adventures of traveling and camping and climbing, and that sounds fun. And then the whole world is there to climb. The maniacs who have to climb every tall mountain in the world, the
ones who do it with no ropes.
No, big safety net, but so that's what it is, right? As Stas was saying, it, you can get to the point where the gym is just not that interesting anymore because you've discovered everything. But in that environment is then the next lead for the place to go to. Yeah. Understanding that 25 times out of the 26 times, it's not going to be the thing, but then the thing is going to be there. And that's the thing that's fulfilling, enlivening. And then you do that over time, of course, and you've traveled this vast distance. Whereas if you don't do any of that, you've sat in your room for 30 years.